I'm an alcoholic. Absolutely. And now as far as education goes, I know that you mentioned in the book, like you have all these statistics about how men are falling behind relative to women.
Yeah.
Why does it matter that it's relative to women? And is it objectively, are they objectively falling compared to men 50 years ago?
So there's a difference, as you point out, between like a relative measure and an absolute measure.
Right.
So if you've got one group doing better than another, then does it matter if everyone's doing okay?
That's my question.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important question, because in some of these areas, you just see boys are doing better than they were, but girls are just doing even better than they were.
Which that seems fine.
So what? That seems fine. So the question is, on its face, does that matter? And you could say the same about the gender pay gap.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so men earn more than women, but women earn a lot more than they used to. So does it matter that there's a gender pay gap? Right? If women are earning a lot more than they did, does it matter if they're earning less than men?
Right.
Well, yes, because that's about economic power. It's about resources. About what you can buy. Right? What you can do. So does it matter? Does this thing matter? Does education matter? Well, if education matters for the chances to have a good flourishing life, if it's a way to get into the labor market and succeed, then you should at least be attentive to gaps by gender, by race, by class, by geography. If you say, well, why is one group doing so much worse than another group? I think at the very least you should see that as a data point to go investigate and see if there's anything structural happening there and see whether or not it matters. So if education doesn't matter, it doesn't matter if boys aren't doing as well as
Right.
girls.
Yeah.
If earnings don't matter, like imagine a world where everyone has a universal basic income anyway.
Sure.
You don't need earnings. Would the earnings gap matter? No.
Right.
And so you're asking a sharp question, which is to what extent does it matter? The reason I worry about what's happening to boys and men is that in some cases you just see almost no absolute improvement in their overall education, but also just because in the current labor market, education does matter.
Right.
So on its face, we used to worry about gender inequality in education the other way around.
Right.
And we were right to worry about that because of what it meant about the labor market. And I think we should worry about it for boys and men for the same reasons.
That makes sense. And now I'm sometimes leery of like statistical abnormalities, right? Like that's like a Mark Twain quote, right? Like lies, damn lies, statistics. So like when you get all these statistics, I sometimes look at it, I'm like, well, is this telling the whole story? How can I trust these statistics are not accounting for, these are just, not corollary and they're actually causal or vice versa.
Yeah.
So is there possible that boys are going to college at lesser rates because they're pursuing entrepreneurship at higher rates, or because they're doing other things outside of college that then would sort of indicate that statistical anomaly?
Well, I think the first thing is the basic point you've made is an important one to just pause on anyway, which is essentially in the current environment, you can decide what you believe and then go find some statistics that support you.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
That's especially with the internet and so on too. Now, so the problem with that is how good are those statistics? You can almost choose your statistics. You can choose which year, how you adjust it for inflation, who you include. There's a whole bunch of boring stuff you can do
Exactly.
to get you the result you want.
Yeah.
And so I actually think, given that I'm a Brookings scholar, I am duty bound to try and call it as I see it and produce the best statistics I possibly can.
Could you explain what that is to me, by the way? I'm not an academic. I don't know if you can tell. Okay. I have long hair.
Well, there's a lot of academics with long hair. I assume you could be a sociology professor.
You think so?
Definitely.
That is an insult. Okay.
Definitely.
I feel it as an insult.
I apologize. Maybe I should be apologizing to sociology.
Yeah, exactly.
professors.
Yeah. That's on
I don't know
sociology.
who I'm offending here, but anyway, everybody as usual.
Yeah. So what does it mean to be a Brookings scholar? Like, what is that?
So Brookings is it's a think tank. It's a policy think tank. We do research that's intended to make public policy better. We're not partisan. So like I'm not looking over my shoulder caring whether the Republicans are going to hate this or Democrats are going to hate that. It's just like, this is what I think. This is how we think you should proceed. And it could be on income inequality. It could be on college debt cancellation. It could be foreign policy. And so we try and be expert, but not partisan.
Right.
And so I do think that's genuinely something I take very seriously, which is that if I say something, A, if I get it wrong, I'll correct myself. But B, I don't want people to think that I'm just selecting the facts that suit my argument.
Right.
What we have too much of that. We too much like opinion-based fact selection.
Yeah.
And so you're right to say, okay, let's say guys aren't going to college as much. Is that a problem? It's a question, not an answer.
Right.
Let's go find out. And it is a problem because the guys who aren't going to college, who are struggling to get into the labor market, if they were looking after their kids, say, right, while their partners or wives are working, okay.
Right.
Actually, in many ways, you see that's a hugely positive change. If they were starting up successful new businesses, you'd be like, okay, no problem.
Right.
But they're not.
Yeah.
By and large, it's just detached from the labor market. And so they're much more likely to be drifting or not quite sure what they're doing, figuring it out. And that's not necessarily a bad thing either, but it's not as if we know what they are doing instead of education or employment, and those things are good.
Right.
It's that we don't really know what they're doing.
That makes sense. And I know that, we talked about this briefly before, but this is a tenuous subject, right? To be talking about like, hey, actually boys are falling behind in school and boys are falling behind in the labor market. Like that is something that is kind of controversial to say now, in our current political climate. So most of your work before this has been about, class inequality, racial inequality. How did this get on your radar, and why is this something that you're so passionate about that you would potentially, like risk public judgment to go into this field?
Well, the first point you make is absolutely true, of course, because these issues are so fraught. They're so politicized. They're very personal to people. And I want to be clear that I totally understand that. I totally understand how even talking about this can create a sort of visceral reaction, especially in women. I mean, like, I have a wife who's trying to raise money right now for a startup business. And so I know that only 2% of venture capital money goes to female founders.
Oh, really?
I'm reminded of this on a least a daily basis. And she is someone who, compared to her mum and so on, has really benefited from the changes of the last few decades.
Right.
The transformation. It's such a recent change that to suddenly start saying, oh, wait, do we need to worry about the boys and the men now? Like it was literally yesterday that women were having to fight to get into these institutions. And by the way, there's still a huge amount more to do, especially at the top of society, in terms of politics and corporate leadership and so on too. So I totally get that this is difficult. So then why enter into it? Well, I've raised 3 boys for one thing. And so I think I should say that because it's crazy to pretend that doesn't affect your scholarship.
Sure.
Right? We just talked about being objective and non-partisan, but that's not the same thing as not being human.
Yeah, exactly.
And clearly the book is influenced. I talk about my sons in the book. The book is dedicated to my 3 boys, all now in their 20s.
Right.
My oldest son is the same age as you.
Oh, really?
Which is terrifying for both of us.
Yeah,
probably.
exactly.
And so I've raised them in the UK and the US and seen a little bit what it was like for them to grow up in this world.
Oh, wow.
But then in my day job, like I'm looking at trends, I'm looking at policy, I'm looking at statistics, and I kept tripping across some pretty big issues around gender, and not in the traditional way you'd think about it. You traditionally would think, oh, gender inequality, worry about women and girls.
Of course.
But especially for black boys and men, and especially for working class boys and men, there's a lot to worry about. Threefold higher rate of suicide or death of despair. We've already talked about education, detachment from the labor market. There's a bunch of stuff happening with boys and men now that cut across some of our other concerns around economic inequality and just basically human flourishing. If your goal is to promote human flourishing for as many people as possible, regardless of their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, where they grew up, etc., then you see a group who are struggling, then you draw attention to that group and try to come up with some solutions.
That makes sense.
In a sense, it's, the risk of sounding really pompous about this, sort of like if a Brookings scholar working on issues of inequality can't take the risk of talking about this issue,
who can? Yeah.
And also it becomes a vicious circle if you don't talk about this stuff, because you're afraid that people go, oh, yeah, alt-right, men's right, lunatic, etc. Then it means the only people who are willing to talk about this stuff are alt-right, men's rights, lunatics. So the cycle turns.
It might be the least qualified people that are talking about important issues that then alienate people even further.
Correct. So if people of goodwill don't engage with the issue, then we shouldn't be surprised if people of less goodwill, let's put it that way, are the ones talking about it.
Yeah.
And so my work in this space, I'll be completely candid about the strategy for the book here with you, is yes, it's about content. It's got charts and policies and so on, but it's also about creating space. It's about creating space for this kind of conversation. It's about creating the opportunity for you and I to talk about this in a way that is hopefully respectful of all sides, understands the nuances and complexity of it, but still has the conversation, that you are frankly willing to have this conversation. Right. And I'm sure you're going to get hit a little bit, but by and large, I've been pleasantly surprised. People are much better at having 2 thoughts in their head at once than most people think they are.
Yeah.
So that's why I ended up writing it.